The frost had not yet lifted from the fields when Eli Turner stepped out of his cabin. Dawn lay pale and brittle across the valley, a thin line of light cutting through the cold air. His breath came out in ghosts, rising and vanishing as quickly as they formed. He had been up before the sun, mending a broken fence post by lantern glow, his fingers numb from the chill. Winter had settled early this year hard, and without apology. He moved slow across the yard, boots sinking into frozen mud, the boards of the barn creaking under his weight. The land was quiet except for the wind whispering through the cottonwoods and the far-off moan of a coyote. When he pushed open the barn door, the smell of hay and horse sweat greeted him, familiar and grounding. But there was something else too, a faint stirring, a hush of breath that didn't belong to the animals. Eli froze, his eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that's when he saw them. A woman and 6 children lay huddled in the hay, wrapped in rags and blankets that looked as thin as paper. The youngest, a boy no older than 4, was pressed against the woman's chest, her arm curved protectively around him. The others lay close together, their faces drawn, skin pale beneath a film of dust. For a long moment, Eli didn't move. He only listened to the soft, fragile sound of their breathing and the faint scrape of wind against the barn walls. The woman stirred, startled awake. Her eyes gray as winter water met his, wide and wary. She sat up, clutching the child tighter, her voice rough from cold and fear. "We'll go," she whispered. "Just give us a minute." Eli said nothing. He took in the sight of them, the thin wrists, the hollow cheeks, the faint tremor in her hands. Her dress was torn at the hem, her boots worn through. There was something about her posture, tired but unbroken, that caught at him like a thorn in the skin. "You got no place to go?" he asked finally. She hesitated, as if unsure whether it was a question or an accusation. "Not anymore," she said. The words hung heavy in the air. He turned, walked to the stall, and took down an old wool blanket from a peg. Without a word, he tossed it toward her. She caught it, confusion flickering across her face. "Don't reckon the horse's mind sharing," he muttered, his voice low. It wasn't kindness that made him do it. Not exactly. It was something quieter, deeper, the kind of ache a man feels when he sees another soul closer to breaking than his own. He knew that feeling too well. He left the barn without another word. Inside his cabin, the fire had burned low, a dull orange glow in the hearth. Eli poured himself coffee that had gone cold overnight, then poured it out again. He couldn't shake the image of the woman's eyes, wary, but not yet defeated. Something in them reminded him of his wife Anna, before the sickness took her. He'd buried her 6 winters ago beneath the cottonwood tree by the creek. Since then, silence had been his only companion. By midday, he returned to the barn with a pail of water and a few biscuits wrapped in cloth. The woman was still there, sitting upright, the children awake now, staring at him with wide, hollow eyes. "You can stay till the weather clears," he said simply. "Ain't much, but it's warmer than the road." She nodded slowly, eyes filling with something that looked like disbelief. "My name's Mara," she said after a long pause. He tipped his hat slightly. Eli. It was a start, clumsy, uncertain, but real. Over the next few days, he watched as Mara tended to her children with quiet determination. She mended torn clothes with bits of twine, fetched water from the well, and helped feed the animals without being asked. The little ones began to play again, chasing each other through the straw, their laughter faint but alive. At night, when the wind howled across the plains, Eli lay awake, listening to the sounds from the barn, the murmur of her voice as she soothed a child, the soft rustle of hay. The loneliness that had once been as constant as his own heartbeat began to shift, taking on a different shape. One evening, as he brought more firewood to the barn, he saw her standing by the open door, staring out at the horizon where the last of the light bled away. "You ought to come inside," he said. "It gets colder after dark." She turned to him, her hair coming loose around her face. "I'm used to it," she murmured. "Cold don't scare me much anymore." Eli looked at her for a long time. The words caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. "Maybe it should," he said quietly, and walked back toward the cabin. But that night, He left the door unlatched. The wind came down from the north like a warning. It pushed low across the pasture and rattled the dry cottonwood leaves that still clung in stubborn handfuls to the branches. The sky held no warmth. There was a taste of iron in the air, the kind that said snow was not far off. Eli moved along the fence line with his gloves tucked in his belt, hands bare despite the sting. It kept him awake. It kept him thinking. He had not meant for this to happen. He had meant to offer one night, maybe two. He had meant to do the smallest decent thing and then return to the life he understood, the kind that asked nothing from him but labor. A man could live a long time like that, half shut, like an old door, warped in the frame. He had been doing it for years. But now there were children's voices on his land, and the shape of another life inside his barn. By midday he had convinced himself to go into town. He hitched the wagon, loaded nothing in it to keep from drawing questions, and rode the slow rutted road into Ordway. He kept his hat low. He did not much care for talk. Ordway was not much. A line of buildings worn down by wind and use. A mercantile. A feed store with a warped porch and a split sign. A church that rang its bell on Sundays and sometimes on Thursdays if the preacher felt people needed reminding. The town had a way of seeing a man whether he wanted seeing or not. Eli stopped at the mercantile and bought flour, dried beans, salt pork, and coffee. He added lye soap and needles, then hesitated before taking a small sack of sugar off the shelf. He did not eat much sweet himself anymore. Had not since Anna. But he remembered that children did. At the counter, Miss Laramie counted his total the way she always did, fast and sure and loud enough to be heard by anyone pretending not to listen. "You planning on feeding an army out there, Eli Turner?" He did not look up. "Cold coming. Figured I'd get ahead of it." She said, and he could hear the shape of doubt in that small sound. "You bring back that wagon next time, you hear me? Last month you swore you'd fix my porch rail, and you ain't done it yet." "I'll see to it," he said. He paid in folded bills. He did not like parting with money this time of year. Winter always cost more than a man thought it would. But when he turned to go, Miss Laramie called after him, voice softer. "And Eli?" He paused. "Tell whoever you're feeding," she said, careful now, eyes steady on him, "that Ordway ain't the worst place for folks who fell on hard ground. We seen worse, and we ain't dead yet." He held her gaze for a breath, then gave the barest nod and left. The road back felt longer. As the wagon rocked, Eli let his mind go where he did not usually let it. Back to the year the fever came through, when Anna's skin burned so hot he could feel it without touching her. The doctor from over the ridge had said there was nothing wrong with her lungs, but Eli knew that was a lie meant for hopeful men. He had sat by the bed and wiped her face and told her she would get through it because that was what a husband was supposed to say. She had looked at him with glassy eyes and whispered, "You'll be all right, Eli." It had angered him, even then. The way she had left him before she was gone. He had dug her grave himself. He had not wept at the burial. He had only stood there in the cold, hat in his hands, like a boy called forward for punishment. When the others left, he stayed. The shovel leaned against the cottonwood, and the ground at his feet was torn and raw, and he had thought, "This is the end of the noise. This is the start of the quiet." For 6 winters he had lived inside that quiet. Now there were 7 new breaths in his barn. When he rolled back into the yard, Mara was out by the pump working the handle, shoulders set, jaw tight. Her skirt was pinned up to the knee to keep it from dragging in the mud, and her hands were red from cold water. The oldest boy was stacking wood as best he could manage with thin arms. A girl, maybe 10, maybe 11, was trying to sweep the packed dirt near the door with a broom that had lost more straw than it had left. They stopped when they saw him, the way deer go still at the crack of a twig. "I got food," Eli said. He climbed down from the wagon and began unloading sacks. He did not say it gentle, and he did not put a smile on it. He did not know how to do that kind of talking anymore. "Ain't much, but it'll hold a while." The children looked to Mara. Mara looked to Eli. Her eyes softened. Not much, just the smallest shift, like thaw beginning under ice. "We'll work for it," she said. "You already are," he answered. That settled something between them. They carried everything into the cabin because he would not have them cooking in the barn with dry hay underfoot. The cabin wasn't large. 1 main room, rough table, iron stove, narrow bed in the corner, and a second cot he kept folded against the wall. He had built the place with Anna. Every board carried memory. He had not meant to let strangers into that space. Yet here they were, filling it, changing the air. Mara moved in that kitchen like she had belonged there all along. Not bold, not comfortable, careful, respectful. She set the beans to soak, sliced the salt pork thin, and sent one of the children, Nora, the quiet girl with watchful eyes, to mind the pot. The others she kept close, making them wash their hands and sit at the table instead of touching everything like hungry creatures. Eli watched the way they obeyed her. Not out of fear, out of a worn, practiced trust. He found himself speaking without meaning to. "Where's their father?" Mara did not look up. Her hands kept moving, steady as rope work. "Buried outside of Julesburg, 3 weeks back." He swallowed. "What happened?" "He owed a man," she said simply. There was nothing else said for a while. After they ate, the smallest boy fell asleep at the table with his cheek against his forearm. The oldest girl tucked a loose curl from his face and hummed something under her breath, something without words. Mara stood by the stove, staring into the low fire. "I'll find work," she said quietly. "If there's a ranch needs washing or mending or cooking, I'll take it. I ain't asking you to carry us." Eli rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Folks round here talk." "They always do," she said. "They'll talk more seeing you set up on my place." At that, she finally faced him, her chin lifted. There was tired in her eyes. There was pride under it. "Let them," she said. Something in his chest shifted again. Something tight, long knotted, loosened a measure. "Snow's coming," he said. "You'll stay through it." She studied him for a long moment. "All right," she said. Trust was not declared. It was just that. That night he brought in the spare cot and laid it out. He gave the children the bed and Mara the cot, and he himself slept in a chair with a blanket over his shoulders and his hat pulled down low. He listened in the dark to the soft chorus of their breathing. It had been years since another human sound had filled this room through the night. It did not feel like losing ground. It felt like something alive had stepped back into a house that had gone still. Snow came at dawn, silent and thick. It fell in a slow drift that covered the world without sound, the kind of snow that turned fences into ghosts and buried every track that led away. Eli woke before first light, the air inside the cabin sharp with cold. The fire had died sometime in the night, and his breath clouded the air. Across the room, Mara was awake too, her shoulders rising and falling beneath the wool blanket. One of the children whimpered in their sleep. She reached out, stroked the child's hair, and murmured something too soft to catch. Eli rose, fed the fire, and poured water from the kettle into a dented tin cup. His hands were clumsy with the chill, but he didn't curse. He had lived long enough to know that the world never bent for a man's temper. He looked at Mara and said quietly, "We'll be snowed in by midday." She nodded, still watching the children. "Then we best make the most of it." It was the first time he'd heard a bit of light in her voice, small, almost hidden, like a flame catching on damp kindling. By morning, the snow had buried the wagon wheels. The children took to the window, pressing their fingers against the frost, their laughter muffled but real. Eli hadn't heard laughter inside these walls since Anna's voice used to fill the evenings with songs. The sound twisted something deep in him, a pain so old it had grown quiet, now stirred awake. He stepped outside to clear the path to the barn, the snow biting against his cheeks. The world was white and endless. His boots sank deep, each step crunching beneath him. When he reached the barn, he paused, listening to the horses breathing inside, steady, calm, unaware of the storm. He thought of Mara and the children huddled around his stove, and for the first time in years, he felt his solitude begin to thaw. When he returned, Mara was kneeling by the hearth, sleeves rolled up, stirring a pot of beans and salt pork. Steam curled around her hair, catching the light. The oldest girl was sewing a torn mitten, and the little ones sat nearby, their cheeks flushed from the warmth. The cabin smelled of smoke and food and life. "You keep a place like this too clean," Mara said without looking up. "Most men don't." Eli gave a dry half-smile. "Most men don't live with ghosts." She looked up at that, eyes searching his face. "I figured as much." He sat at the table, the chair groaning beneath his weight. How'd you end up on the road? She stirred the pot again before answering. My husband worked cattle up near Julesburg. The ranch went under last spring. He took up gambling to make the money back. Her voice caught a little, but she didn't pause. He lost it all. Then he lost more. We left town when the men he owed came looking. He thought he could make things right, find work farther south. But the fever took him before he could. She fell silent. Only the sound of the fire filled the space between them. Eli looked down at his hands, calloused and cracked from years of rope and cold. You did what you could, he said softly. She met his eyes. You don't know what I did. He didn't press her. Some truths didn't need light to exist. They lived just fine in the dark. Days passed in quiet rhythm. Snow kept falling. Mara washed clothes by the fire, hanging them along the rafters to dry. The children helped stack wood, fetched water, learned to brush down the horses. Eli watched them adapt to the land, awkward at first, then steady. The youngest, Tommy, followed him everywhere, small boots leaving tiny prints beside Eli's. One evening, when the sky burned red before dusk, Eli found Mara standing outside, her shawl drawn tight, staring at the horizon. Cold'll cut through you standing like that, he said. She smiled faintly. I used to like sunsets. Back home, they'd paint the river gold. My husband always said the light out here was too hard. He wasn't wrong. Eli looked out with her. The light hit the snow in fierce, dazzling streaks. Hard light shows the truth, he said. Mara turned toward him. And what truth's that, Mr. Turner? He met her gaze. That we're still standing. Something passed between them then, not a word, not a promise, just the quiet understanding of two people who had seen loss and kept breathing anyway. That night, while the children slept, she mended his torn workshirt by lamplight. Her fingers were quick and sure, and Eli sat nearby, sharpening his knife just for the sound of it, the scrape of metal, the hum of thread through cloth. When she finished, she folded the shirt neatly and handed it to him. You ought to take better care of things, she said. He nodded once. Guess I forgot how. Her eyes softened, but she said nothing more. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had weight now, like earth after a thaw, ready to grow something new if the sun stayed long enough. Outside, the storm quieted. Inside, the warmth held steady. By the third week, the snow had hardened into ice. Each morning, the light struck it like glass, bright enough to hurt the eyes. Eli moved through his chores slow and deliberate, his breath a steady fog in the still air. The cold had settled into his bones, but he found he did not mind it as much as he once had. There was warmth enough now in the cabin to fight it off voices, laughter, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of tin cups. Mara had brought life back into the place without meaning to. She rose before dawn, kindled the fire, and set the kettle to boil. The children stirred soon after, padding barefoot across the rough plank floor, the youngest ones rubbing sleep from their eyes. She moved among them with the quiet strength of someone who had carried too much for too long and had learned to do it without complaint. Eli watched her sometimes from the doorway, the light catching the curve of her face, the way she tucked loose hair behind her ear while tending to the pot. He didn't think of her as pretty in the way of the women who came through Ordway for dances or Sunday markets. Mara was made of something truer, lined with care and scarred by wind, but still standing. There was beauty in that kind of endurance, the kind that didn't ask to be noticed. They had fallen into rhythm unspoken, practical but real. She mended, he worked the land. She read to the children from an old prayer book she'd carried from place to place, the cover worn to softness. At night, after they slept, she'd sit by the stove and darn socks while Eli smoked his pipe, both of them quiet but not lonely. It was on one of those nights that trouble came. A horse approached from the ridge. Eli heard it before he saw it, the sound of hooves cutting through snow crust. He stepped outside, coat half-buttoned, and watched as a rider came into view, the figure dark against the moonlight. When the man drew closer, Eli recognized him, Harlan Pike, a rancher from town, and not the kind a man wanted on his doorstep after dark. Pike swung down from his horse, boots crunching on ice. "Evenin', Turner," he said, voice carrying a false cheer. Ellie didn't answer. He knew Pike's type smile first, trouble after. Pike brushed snow from his coat. "Heard you got company out here, woman and a passel of kids." Eli's hand rested loosely near the knife on his belt. "What's it to you?" Pike grinned. "Word gets around. Folks in town say she's the widow of Luke Caldwell. That true?" Eli didn't flinch, but something in his chest tightened. Caldwell. The name meant something in these parts. Gambler. Drifter. A man who'd made enemies faster than he made friends. "She told me her husband's dead," Eli said evenly. "Oh, he's dead all right," Pike said. "But he left behind more than debts. I got men looking for what he owed. You wouldn't happen to know if she's got anything of value with her, would you?" Eli stared at him, jaw tight. "You best ride home, Pike. Roads'll freeze come midnight." Pike chuckled, the sound dry as splintered wood. "You always were a quiet one, Turner. Maybe too quiet to notice when you're getting tangled up in another man's mess." He looked toward the cabin, where a flicker of light glowed behind the window. "Pretty woman, though. Can't say I blame you for—" Eli stepped forward, his voice low. "That's enough." The space between them went still. For a moment, only the wind spoke. Then Pike shrugged, mounted up again, and turned his horse toward town. "Suit yourself," he called over his shoulder. "Just don't say I didn't warn you when the past comes knocking." Eli stood there, long after the sound of hooves had faded. Snow began to fall again, thin flakes melting on his coat. He felt the weight of old things pressing down, the kind that didn't belong to him but would find him anyway. When he returned inside, Mara was standing near the door, eyes wide. She had heard enough. "Who was that?" she asked. "Harlan Pike," Eli said. "Knows your husband's name." Her face went pale. She steadied herself against the table. "Then it won't be long before others know where we are." Eli's mind was already moving, slow and certain. "You're safe here," he said. "You can't promise that." "I can," he replied quietly, "and I will." Mara looked at him then as if seeing something she hadn't before, not just a man keeping his distance, but someone who had chosen to stand beside her when the world would not. That night neither of them slept much. The fire burned low, shadows stretching across the walls. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and steady, covering every trace of the rider's path. By morning, the world was clean again, but the danger, like the past, was only buried for a while. By the fourth morning, the snow had crusted into glittering armor, hard enough to bear a man's weight. The air burned with cold so deep it made the lungs ache. Eli woke to the sound of boots at the door, soft, cautious steps. He reached for his rifle out of habit, but it was only Mara, wrapped in his old coat, her breath a pale cloud in the dim light. "The stove's gone out," she said quietly. He swung his legs from the chair and rose, joints stiff. "I'll see to it." The fire was nothing but a black pit of ash and half-burned wood. He crouched, struck a match, and fed it slowly, kindling first, then bark, then logs. Mara knelt beside him, her fingers steady as she worked the bellows. In the flicker of light, he could see the faint red in her cheeks, the weary grace in her movements. She had endured things he didn't yet have words for, but she bore them without complaint. When the fire caught, she sat back on her heels and exhaled. "Feels like the whole world's gone to sleep under that snow." Eli looked at the window. "World don't sleep. It just waits." Mara nodded, eyes distant. "Sometimes I wish it didn't." The children woke one by one, tumbling from their blankets like small, warm animals. Breakfast was thin porridge and bits of dried apple. They ate it without complaint. The littlest boy, Tommy, climbed into Eli's lap as though it were his birthright. Eli stiffened at first, then gave in. The child's weight was light, his small hand curling around one of Eli's fingers. Mara watched from across the table, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "He's taken to you." Eli grunted. "He's got no sense then." But Tommy only laughed, a bright, sharp sound that cut clean through the quiet. By afternoon, the weather began to change. The wind shifted, bringing the smell of thaw and distance. Eli stepped outside to check the sky. To the west, clouds were breaking apart, and the line of the horizon stood clear and sharp. For the first time in weeks, the world looked alive again. He returned to find Mara mending a sleeve at the table. Her oldest girl, Clara, was reading aloud from the prayer book, her voice soft but sure. The cabin was warm, filled with the rhythm of work and breath and words. Eli paused in the doorway. the weight of it all settling in him, this small, unlikely peace. "Looks like the weather's turning," he said. Mara lifted her eyes. "You think spring's coming?" He shrugged. "Sooner or later, it always does." For a while, they worked in silence. Then, without looking up, she asked, "You ever think about leaving this place?" Eli leaned against the wall. "Used to. Thought I'd sell the land, head south, start over somewhere I didn't have to see what I lost." "And why didn't you?" He thought about that. "Maybe because there's nowhere a man can go where he doesn't take himself along." Mara smiled faintly. "That's true enough." Outside, the snow began to melt, dripping from the roof in slow, steady rhythm. The sound filled the cabin like a clock ticking toward something unseen. That evening, just before dark, a wagon appeared at the edge of the ridge. Eli saw at first two figures bundled tight, moving slow through the slush. He felt a weight settle low in his gut. When they came close enough, he recognized one of them. Pike again, and another man beside him, broad-shouldered, scar across his jaw, the kind of man who made trouble for money. Eli stepped out to meet them. "Evenin' again," Pike called. His voice carried that same false charm, stretched thin over something mean. "Hope I'm not interruptin' your charity work." "You are," Eli said. The man beside Pike spat into the snow. "We just come for what's owed. Woman's husband took a loan off Pike here before he croaked. Left behind some personal property." Eli's jaw tightened. "Ain't nothing here that belongs to you." The man smirked. "That so? Maybe we'll let the lady tell us that herself." Before Eli could speak, the cabin door opened. Mara stood framed in the light, her shawl drawn close, the children's faces peering out behind her. "You get off this land," she said, her voice steady as iron. "There's nothing here for you." Pike shifted in his saddle. Now, Mrs. Caldwell." "My name's Mara," she snapped, cutting him off. "And my husband's debts died with him." Pike opened his mouth, but Eli took a step forward, his rifle leveled at the man's chest. "You heard her." The other man laughed, low and ugly. "You gonna shoot us both, cowboy?" "If I have to." Something in Eli's voice must have reached them, the calm certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose. Pike looked at the rifle, then at Eli, and after a long moment, tugged on the reins. "Reckon she ain't worth the trouble," he muttered, spitting into the snow. "Come on." They turned and rode off into the gray, leaving two sets of tracks that the wind began to erase at once. Eli lowered the rifle but didn't move until they were gone. When he turned, Mara was still in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes bright with something like fear and something else. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "It do it again." The silence that followed was heavy, but not cold. There was understanding in it, two people who knew the cost of standing their ground. Later, after the children were asleep, she sat beside him at the fire. Neither spoke for a long time. The flames shifted and cracked, throwing light on the worn wood of the floor, the patched clothes hanging by the hearth, the small signs of survival. Finally, she said, "I don't know what happens next." Eli looked into the fire. Maybe that's the best part. Outside, the wind had died. The snow was melting into the earth, dark and rich. The thaw had begun. The thaw deepened over the next week, slow and sure. The fields began to breathe again beneath their heavy blanket of ice. Water carved small secret rivers between the fence posts, and the air filled with the smell of mud and waking earth. Crows called from the cottonwoods, black against the pale sky. Eli worked from dawn till dark, mending what the winter had broken: the fence along the south pasture, the roof above the barn, the hand pump that always froze too early and thawed too late. The world was busy again, as if the long silence of winter had only been a pause before another fight. Mara and the children moved with the same purpose. The girls swept the cabin clean, beating the rugs out on the line until dust rose in clouds. The boys carried buckets of water from the creek, splashing more on themselves than they brought home. And Mara worked harder than all of them. She dug into the earth near the cabin's edge, turning the soil, her hands raw and red. She said it was for a garden come spring, though she had no seeds yet to plant. Eli watched her from a distance, that fierce determination stirring something in him he had not felt in years, a tenderness he did not trust but could not deny. One evening, near sunset, he walked down to where she knelt in the dirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair coming loose. The light caught in the strands, gold against the wind-chilled brown. "You'll wear yourself out before the thaw's done," he said. She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I've been worn out before," she said with a tired smile. He crouched beside her, the earth soft beneath his boots. "You don't have to prove anything here." Mara looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not about proving, Eli. It's about belonging. I've been running too long not to put roots somewhere." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water's small sound, deep ripples. He nodded slowly. "Then this'll do." She looked away, out toward the horizon where the light was fading. "You mean that?" He hesitated, then said, "I don't say what I don't mean." For a long while they said nothing. The wind stirred the grass still buried beneath the snowmelt. Somewhere a lone horse whinnied, the sound carrying far. That night, after the children slept, Eli sat by the fire cleaning his rifle. Mara was at the table, mending one of the boys' coats. The silence between them had become easy now, filled with small sounds, the scrape of metal, the pull of thread. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Pike won't be back." Mara didn't look up. "You sound certain." "I've seen his kind all my life. He talks bigger than he acts. He got what he wanted once, fear, and now he's had to swallow the taste of his own." She nodded slowly, her needle stilling in her hand. "You risked more than you should have for us." Eli set the rifle aside. "That wasn't risk. That was right." She lifted her head then, studying him in the dim light. "You've lost something, haven't you?" He let out a slow breath. "A wife, a child that never came, a life that could have been." The words hung there, bare and unguarded. He hadn't spoken them aloud since the day Anna was buried. Mara's voice softened. "I'm sorry." He shrugged, though the movement was tight. "Time's made peace with it mostly. But the quiet, it stays, like a place you go back to when you can't find your way anywhere else." Her eyes met his across the small room. "And have you found your way, Eli Turner?" He thought about it, the flicker of firelight on her face, the sound of the children breathing in the next room. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe I have." Outside, rain began to fall, a slow, steady patter on the roof. The sound filled the silence, wrapping around them like a promise. The next morning brought the first true warmth of spring. The fields were damp and dark, the air rich with scent. Eli hitched the wagon and drove into town for supplies, taking 2 of the children along to fetch new boots and flour. When he returned, the cabin smelled of fresh bread. Mara stood by the stove, her hair tied back with a strip of linen, her cheeks flushed from the heat. The children ran out to meet him, laughing, their arms full of early wildflowers they'd gathered near the creek. They handed them to him proudly, petals crushed in small hands. "For you," said Clara, the oldest, smiling shyly. "Mama said you made the land safe again." Eli looked down at the flowers, white, yellow, trembling, and then at Mara standing in the doorway, watching. "Keep them," he said softly, handing them back. "They'll last longer in your hands." But later, when she wasn't looking, he placed one small bloom on the mantel, beside the old photograph of Anna that had stood there untouched for years. The 2 women seemed to meet there in quiet understanding, the one gone, the other found. That night, the air was warm enough that they left the door open a crack to let in the wind. The children slept without blankets for the first time in months. Eli sat outside on the step, pipe in hand, listening to the night frogs in the creek. Mara joined him after a while, sitting close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. "Feels strange," she said. "All this peace, like it could vanish if we breathed too loud." Eli turned to her. "It don't vanish," he said. "It just waits for someone to notice it." She looked at him, eyes bright in the moonlight. "And you noticed?" He nodded once. "I did." For a long time they sat there, saying nothing more, the stars wheeling slow above them, the land wide and quiet and kind for the first time in a long while. Inside, a candle burned low. On the table, a loaf of bread cooled beside 2 empty cups. And outside, spring gathered its courage across the dark plains. Spring came all the way by late April, slow but certain. The snowmelt fed the creek until it ran clear and loud again, cutting its song through the quiet valley. The cottonwoods unfurled new leaves, tender and green, trembling in the first warm winds. The earth smelled of rain and life. Eli Turner's ranch, once gray and hollow, began to fill with motion children running barefoot through the grass. Chickens scratching at the thawed soil, the smoke from the chimney rising steady and sure. The land, like the man himself, was learning how to live again. He rose early each morning, sometimes before the light, and found Mara already up, the coffee pot on the stove, her hair damp from washing in the creek. The children were never far behind, Tommy tugging at his boots, Clara scolding him with the patience of a grown woman. The sound of them filled the cabin, a sound Eli once thought he'd never bear again, but now he found himself waiting for it. By mid-morning, he and Mara worked side by side in the field. She turned the soil with careful strokes, humming low to herself. Eli built the fence around the patch she'd claimed for a garden. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Words were for those who didn't yet understand silence. One afternoon, as they worked, a wagon came up the ridge. For a moment, Eli's hand went to his side, old habit and warning in his bones. But the wagon was smaller, the mule slow, the figure driving it dressed in preacher's black. Reverend Gaines from Ordway, come to see about the children's schooling and the moral state of things, as he called it. He greeted Eli first, then Mara, his eyes sharp though his smile tried to be kind. Word travels, he said. Folks say the widow Caldwell's taken up residence here. She has, Eli said, and her name's Mara. Gaines nodded, looking between them. It's a good thing, I suppose, two souls helping one another. But the town, well, it wonders. You ain't kin. Eli's jaw worked once before he spoke. We're building something here. Maybe that's enough. The preacher studied him, then turned to Mara. You're a strong woman, Mrs. Caldwell, but a woman alone people will talk. There's the matter of propriety, of example for your children. Mara's eyes didn't waver. My children have known hunger and cold and what it means to be left behind. If the town finds sin and shelter, that's their burden, not mine. Gaines hesitated, then nodded stiffly. You've got spirit, he said, though it wasn't quite a compliment. I'll pray the Lord watches over you both. When he was gone, Eli and Mara stood in the field, the wind tugging at their clothes. You mind what he said? Eli asked. Mara smiled faintly. I stopped minding what folks say a long time ago. That night, the sky opened wide and clear, stars strewn like ash across black water. They sat by the fire outside the cabin, the children asleep within, the air warm enough to breathe without pain. The earth was soft beneath their boots. Mara looked toward the horizon. Do you ever think about starting over? She asked. Eli considered. I used to think starting over meant leaving things behind. Now I think it means facing what's still here. She nodded slowly, eyes glimmering in the firelight. And what's still here? He looked at her for a long time. The lines on her face were not from age but from endurance, from all the storms she'd walked through and refused to die in. You, he said, and them. The fire cracked softly. Mara's gaze fell to her hands, fingers interlaced. You're a good man, Eli Turner. I don't think you believe it yet, but you are. He reached out, rough hand covering hers. Don't know about good, he said. Just trying to be better than I was yesterday. She turned her palm under his, their fingers fitting together like something meant. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, alive with the sound of wind and the faint creak of the porch boards, the heartbeat of a place reborn. Days became weeks, and the world steadied itself. The garden grew, shoots pushed through the dark soil, stubborn and green. Mara's laughter began to ring across the yard. The children learned to ride, to gather eggs, to trust the land as Eli did. The cabin that once echoed with loneliness now hummed with small sounds of life spoons clinking, pages turning, voices soft in the night. By summer, the first wildflowers bloomed again along the fence line. Mara picked a handful one evening and placed them in a tin cup on the table. Eli stood in the doorway watching her, the last light spilling in behind him. You thinking something? She asked. He nodded. That maybe this is what it was all for. Every hard mile, every winter. She smiled. Then let's make it worth it. When the harvest came, it was small but strong beans, corn, a little wheat, all grown from the hands of two people who had once thought the world done with them. They stood together at dusk, looking over what they'd made. The land stretched wide, golden under the sinking Sunday. Eli took off his hat and held it against his chest. "You ever think about staying?" he asked softly. Mara turned to him. "I already have." And that was all. No vows, no promises, just the quiet certainty of two lives choosing to keep walking the same road. That night, when the lamps were low and the children sleeping, he took her hand and led her outside. The stars bent low over the prairie, endless and kind. They stood there, side by side, the wind carrying the scent of earth and new beginnings. "Guess the town'll talk," he said, smiling faintly. "Let them," she whispered. "We've got work to do." And in the hush that followed, with the fields spread out before them and the sky endless above, the cowboy and the widow began the rest of their story, quiet, steadfast, and full of the grace that only hard lives can grow. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called. The land answered, wide and alive, as dawn began to rise once more.